All right, hi everyone. Hope you're having a good con so far. I know it's only 12:30 on a Friday, but welcome. This is
Just make sure
Cosplay.
the door doesn't close is because it cannot open from this way.
Oh shit.
Okay.
For some shenanigans if it closes.
We'll just bang really loud and yell for help. But welcome. I am Minty Honey. I am a cosplayer that's been doing it for a hobby for a really long time. And this is Cosplay 101, and this will mainly go over like fabrics and how to choose them for cosplay. I really love fabrics, so this is kind of like my passion. So yeah, it's kind of like, it's also, I would say it's one of the first building blocks if you're doing a costume that requires clothing of any sort. Obviously there's costumes that require like armor, you don't necessarily need fabric for it, but if you want to get really creative, you could. So, you know, if you guys have any questions throughout the panel, feel free to raise your hand. I don't mind like stopping and just kind of clarifying if you do have any questions. So yeah, without further ado, we can kind of get started. So today I'll kind of go over a couple of different things. We'll start with like different types of fabrics and then do fiber content matter within the fabrics. Getting started overall, and then I'll also have a small Q&A section at the end. Alright, so types of fabrics. Does anyone here in the room have any idea what kind of fabrics there are to exist? I know there's two friends of mine in here, so you don't raise your hands, but yeah. Do you have like a example of a type of fabric?
This is synthetic peony.
Oh, yeah. Anyone else?
Lycra.
Yeah.
I pronounced it right for once.
Yeah. Lycra is a type of fiber, so that's like one thing. Anyone else? If not, I can go ahead and kind of break it down. So there's typically two types of fabrics, one of them being wovens and one being knit. Woven is typically described as what you would, it's created through weaving. So it's like you're literally taking fibers and injecting other fibers into it so it gets to be interlaced together, and that's how that kind of fabric's created. There's three basic constructions for it. You have a plain weave, a twill weave, and a satin weave. So we'll kind of, this is like truly like, if you guys have any questions that can clarify. But yeah, this is kind of like the basics of when it comes to woven. So it's helpful to know when you're going out to like stores like Joann's or something, you're like, oh, I need a fabric for XYZ project, and you kind of have an idea of like what type of drape it needs to be or what type of weight it has to be. And like, I think a lot of the times how it's constructed will help kind of give you that information, just kind of knowing that. Okay, so this is a little bit more technical side, but I'm not expecting anyone to go and like tear apart fabric fiber by fiber, but this is typically how different fabrics are constructed. So plain weave is like the most simplest construction. It's like literally alternating yarns in between each other. And then for satin weaves, it's done in a way where it creates really long gaps diagonally, which helps give this sort of luster and this really nice effect that you can't really get with like plain weaves. And then twill is like, you can literally see the diagonal for it. So like a lot of things like more utilitarian workwear, things that require a little bit more sturdiness, typically tend to be in a twill weave, like garbadine, denim, etc. And that one you can actually physically see where it's like got a diagonal definition in the fabric. Okay. So yeah, so plain weave specifically, it's the most common and simplest weave design. The front and back are typically the same. Sometimes if you go to the store and you're trying to figure out which side is the face side, which side is the back side, if it looks pretty similar to each other, it's typically going to be a plain weave. But within plain weaves, there's different kinds of weaves as well, such as like basket weave and Oxford weave. It's, again, such a simple thing, but like depending on your construction, it gives you a variety of fabrics from like broadcloth, for anyone who's been an intro level cosplayer that like, oh, I need cheap fabric that you can get that's a solid color. You typically can find broadcloth at like a big box store like Joann's. You have canvas, which a lot of different like the canvas tote bags you would get at the store. That's typically what it's used. And you have other specialty things like chiffon, hobble tie, muslin, poplin, and taffeta. But yeah, they're all, it's like the branch starts with like it's a plain weave, but within that there's different categories of those kinds of specialty fabrics. Next with twills, again, it's like you could really see a prominent like diagonal line. It can go either left twill line or a right hand twill line, depending on some places. If you are shopping online, it'll explain something as an S twill or a Z twill. That's kind of just describing whether it's a left or right. If you don't know, you can like literally draw out like an S. It's got like the diagonal part of that's going to go from upwards left, and then Z, it's the same thing, just upwards in the right hand direction. But yeah, within that there's a lot of different twill constructions, as well as like a chevron or a herringbone. A lot of like men's suiting fabrications, when you have that sort of chevron texture, it's done in a twill weave. And then yeah, down below you'll have examples of the different kinds of twill fabrics, like cavalry twill, denim. Denim is typically a 3x1 twill, but it kind of varies a lot now, especially with a lot of fashion denim. Things like flannel shirts, it's a twill, but because it's brushed, you may not see the twill line as much. Garbadine, houndstooth, and tweeds. There are some plain weave tweeds, but yeah, that's kind of an overview of what twills are. And then for satin, so this, like I had mentioned earlier, this because of the way it's constructed, will give you the most smooth and luster when it comes to fabric surfaces. So this is what you imagine if you're going to the Casa section in Joann's, where they have a really large satin, as well as other non-satin satin weave fabrics. Sorry, but yeah, the thing about the construction though, and this, if you've sewn with like some satins, you might notice like, oh, like the fabric is snagging in the needle, and it's just purely because of the construction that it's in, where because it's at a diagonal and you're trying to sew a straight line, it could just snag on one of the fibers that's there. But yeah, but satin, just so that in case you're looking online as well, satin is just for the weave. If you're, some people tend to think that, oh, if it's satin, it's silk. That's not necessarily true. You have like synthetic polyester satins. But yeah, just like one of those things where like, because of nomenclature, some people kind of assume that satin equals silk, but not necessarily true. However, when it comes to a satin weave, if you're constructing something that's like a cotton blend, it won't be called like a cotton satin, it'll be a cotton sateen. That's more of a technical thing, but it's helpful when you're trying to look for something online where, oh, I don't want to work with silk or polyester, but I still want something with a little bit of shine to it. You would look up something like a sateen. And then obviously if you're looking for more silk satins or silk-like satins where they're like synthetic blends, that's something you can look up as well. Okay. And within woven categories, I kind of just went over like the really basic side of woven fabrics, but within that you have really more complicated weaves, such as corduroy, crepe, jacquards, terry, which is like what you would imagine like towel fabrics to be, and velvet and velveteen. So those are all like really specialty things. For things like corduroy and like velvet, it's created in a way where you have loops created in the loom, and then it's literally cut in the machine process, so that way you kind of get the raised fibers and textures, and that's like a whole separate process, but it's really interesting if you ever like go down the rabbit hole of looking up how things are made online. It's really interesting. Okay. And on the opposite end of wovens, you have knits. So knit, you're still taking yarns, but instead of interlacing them together, you're creating loops together. If anyone's ever done hand knitting, you're creating loops within the yarn to kind of create a structure together, and that's what a knit is. Again, there are three types of stitches that are like kind of like the basic, where it's like you have a knit or a jersey stitch, a tuck stitch, and a float. So within the different combinations of those, you can get different kinds of knits. But yeah, it's again, if anyone is really into like yarn work, like crochet is separate. It's instead of using a 2 needle, you have a 1 needle, and you're still creating loops. It's just a little bit different. But yes, when it comes to knits, this is where like you can truly find a lot of different options. If you go clothes shopping, if you're looking for a t-shirt, that's typically going to be a jersey fabrication. The nice thing about knits compared to wovens is that they both fray, but you don't get as much quote unquote fraying with knitting because it's all looped together. So it tends to hold its structure a little bit without falling apart necessarily. And then within, again, knitting, you have a piqué stitch, which is like what you would imagine if you're getting a uniform polo. That's kind of got like little raised textures and bumps. Terry and fleece, that's what you would find for like things like hoodies and sweatshirts. The only difference between a terry and a fleece is that one is like brushed or nap on the backside and the other one has loops. So it's truly the same base. It's just how it's finished that give you the different plushness and benefits of that. And then you have jacquards, which you can also get jacquards within wovens, but the nice thing in knits, like you can print on knit, but this is a really cool way to get pattern work into a fabrication that you're wanting like something like a little bit more stretch and a lot more freedom. Typically you can try and find like a fabric that's more of a jacquard construction. But yeah, there's like all sorts of different knit structures, whether it's like a thermal waffle or scuba. There's so many different kind of knits out there. And I wish I had more fabric swatches to kind of show that, but I do at the end, I do have like a binder of different fabrics up here if anyone would like to come up and look at it. But yeah, it's really interesting to kind of, if you're not into fabric, but when you go out and you're shopping, you're like, oh, I can tell this is a knit shirt versus a woven shirt. Oh, this is like flannel versus fleece. It's just really helpful for you to know as you're shopping of like, oh, I don't like this fabric on my body. Then you can always find something similar or a different construction that might be more comfortable for you or more practical for you for everyday wear. But yes, there's also fabrics that are not necessarily constructed in the same way as you would a woven or knit. So some of those things are like felt fabrics. So like felt is actually just taking fibers and you're compressing it and condensing it together for it to like force to hold its shape together. So this one, if you ever cut felt, it doesn't necessarily fray, but it can you could pick apart at it literally, and you can even combine different felt fabrics through the technique of felting, where you're taking little like small needles and bringing it together to create and condense the fibers manually that like way. The other type is like, technically leather is a type of fabrication, but not everyone can afford or want to use animal skin necessarily. So you also have faux leather or pleather and vinyl, which is made of like, you ever heard of PU leather? It's just polyurethane, and PVC is just polyvinyl chloride, just all chemical based. But there are plant hybrids when it comes to faux leather. So you have some companies are doing banana leaves, cactus, different kinds of things. But most faux leather that you'll see out there, even it's marketed as like vegan, will still have a synthetic component to it. So just something to keep in mind if that's something you're interested in when it comes to making a costume. The other type of fabrication is created through like chainmail, or now these days like 3D printing. I think especially in the 3D print world, there's a lot more innovation happening there, where you can actually 3D print like chainmail to create like a block of chainmail together, and you can like get little rings and kind of loop them together. But yeah, that's something that's like still like even now in the cosplay world, it's being explored in a really lot of cool ways. Some people are making faux dragon scales with like iridescent filament. And what's happening is that they're putting like typically like a mesh fabric, something that's really light and sheer, and 3D printing on top of it. So when you take it off the print bed, it still has a sort of flexibility because it still has a fabric base to it, but it's got a lot more textural interest that you can't really get with fabric in the same way. Okay. And then the next section for this, outside of just how fabric is made, is like what is fabric made of, which is the fibers. So fibers kind of impact a bit of everything when it comes to your cosplay. It matters when if you have a budget, or if you're wanting to have something that looks a certain way, that's where I would say like fiber truly is like an important factor when it comes to fabric. For most people, money is a limited resource. I wish money was unlimited and we can all, be rich and live happy. But because of that, like you may not want to spend too much money on cosplay, or you have a very finite budget. Thinking about what kind of fibers you want to work with is a really good starting point. And this is really kind of due to like what's out, what's limited, right? Like unfortunately things that are like natural fibers, it just depends on the farmer's crops for the season. So like this past year we had a really bad linen crop season. So anything linen has gone up in price. So if you go and try and find linen fabric, or you're just trying to buy like a linen like vacation shirt or something, it's going to be more than it was previously. But yeah, because of that, it's a lot more limited compared to something that's made synthetically that gives you a similar effect like rayon or polyester. And then for fibers, again, it can also impact the final look and performance of your cosplay. If you're wanting something to be comfortable, like in Texas summer, for example, you wouldn't necessarily want 100% polyester for everything because it's not very breathable. It's also gonna end up smelling a lot like after a while compared to like if it was a cotton blend or majority cotton. But yeah, it just kind of depends on what your needs are. I have a little snapshot of from the anime My Dress Up Darling, where one of the episodes it features like, they picked this fabric because it looked really good, but they were wearing it in the summertime and she like overheated because it was really heavy and it didn't breathe. But those are, even though it's from an example from anime, it does happen in real life. The consequences of not picking the right fabric, or even if you are picking the right fabric, it may not be the right season to wear it in. But yes, so when it comes to fibers, the other nice application of this is that depending on what you're wanting to achieve in your cosplay, if you're wanting silk painting, like traditional techniques that apply to certain fabrics, typically silk will end up looking nicer. There are some fabrics that can give you a similar effect, but because silk is like a natural fiber, it absorbs certain paints a little nicer compared to like synthetics. And if anyone's into like movies or like costume design, that's something that a lot of costume designers also take place in. This excerpt in the middle is from Pride and Prejudice, the 2005 adaptation, and one of the things that the costume designer was very intentional on is like picking much more natural fabrics and fabrics that have a lot more of a homey vibe for Elizabeth Bennet, because her family circumstance is a lot she's not as well off as other ladies in society who would typically use a lot more finer fabrics like silk that use like silk fibers. So it's just a nice way if that's something you care about for your character and wanting to represent that. Like if your character's poor, she may not want or she may not necessarily have like a character, like an outfit that is, gilded in gold or silk or anything like that. And also for anyone who's really into like superhero outfits and bodysuits, choosing things typically with spandex give you a lot more recovery if it didn't have it. There are like jerseys that's just like 100% polyester or 100% cotton, but if there's no spandex, it has a harder time recovering on your body and keeping its shape. It could stretch out over time. So just things to keep in mind if you're just, and it does take sometimes just trial and error. Sometimes you pick the wrong fabric and you're like, oh, this isn't working, maybe I have to like pick a different fabric. And that over time, like that just kind of becomes like knowledge that you add to your memories library of like, oh, you learned from your past mistakes and now we're learning about how to do something better. But yeah, so in short, fibers for your cosplay do matter. If you're not sure of what the different fibers there are, some of the natural fibers that exist out there is like cashmere, which is a type of animal fiber. You have cotton, flax, hemp, linen, silk, and wool. I will say, like when it comes to silk, it's so prized because it is a limited resource, but it's one of the few natural fibers that has the longest filament. In that, like, when it comes to cotton, you're picking like cotton hair or cotton balls rather, and you're trying to stretch it out and like turn it into yarn. And because of that, if you ever notice if you're wearing clothes that tend to pill really easily, that's usually the fibers coming apart as you're washing it and wearing it, and that's just kind of natural. So some things will just tend to have a little bit more pilling than others. And some synthetic fibers that you'll see out there, you'll have acetate, acrylic, elastane / spandex, depending on what they decide to call it. Nylon, you have, if you're into 3D printing, PLA is a really popular choice. Polyester, and within rayon, there's 2 categories. There's bamboo, and then there's tencel, which is like not made of bamboo, but it's still taking wood pulp and creating synthetic fibers out of it. And you also have rubber. Okay. So, getting started, which I think is the more fun part. Obviously, it's not the it's like, where do you start with any cosplay project? For me personally, I tend to always start with fabric because most of my costumes tend to be sewing. But if you're doing armor, you'll be looking at other materials such as foam, possibly 3D printing, Warbler, that kind of thing. So, unfortunately, I won't cover any armor or anything like that in this panel, but it kind of, if you're thinking about your costume, this is just how I think about it. Your order may be different, and your your planning process may be different. For me, it's like I like to think about like, okay, what am I trying to make? What's my budget? What resources do I already have? Like, if I'm gonna do I have to order online? Can I just go to a store and buy it? And then the shopping and planning of it. This is all before you make the costume. So, here are some helpful things to know when you're shopping for fabric. If you're not sure about how much fabric you should get, especially if you haven't done like a mock-up or anything like that, or you're trying to get something to get started, one thing I find really helpful is I like to go through, especially if you're shopping in store, but you can also do this online. I like to look up commercial patterns, so patterns from like companies like McCall's, Butterick, Vogue, etc., that kind of have a similar shape or silhouette of what I'm trying to find. And from there, actually on the back of it, it'll tell you like generally how much fabric you can get. For things like circle skirts, you also have resources online. At Mood Fabrics, they actually have a circle skirt calculator if that's something you're planning on doing. There's a lot of things out there that you can look up for free. But yeah, most commercial patterns will tell you just how much fabric you generally need. They usually give you a little bit more in case, if you have a specific pattern or something you're trying to match, you can play around with it. And then for fabric, if anyone's shopped in store or online, there's a lot of different ways you can try and calculate it. One of the ways that's really important is actually how wide is your fabric. Every mill and fabric maker out there has a limitation to how wide their fabrics can be, especially if it's more traditional fabrics, like for things like example in kimonos, the cuttable width is actually really narrow. So that's why a lot of kimonos are done in very long rectangular panels. And a lot of other traditional historically accurate like European clothing will also have a very limited cuttable width because of, again, just how limited fabric was back then before, the industry kind of revolutionized itself and things got wider. But at stores like Joann's, you can actually look on the fabric barcode and it'll tell you just how wide that fabric is, and kind of based off that, like, if you're trying to make something super wide and you only have half that width, then you'll have to piece it together. Just kind of the nature of the fabric. Again, it's like you're limited to how wide you have. But yeah, based off that, if you're ordering online, the rest of that depends on how much fabric length you need. So like in the US, you typically will order things by the yard. If you're outside the US, or if you're ordering from online overseas, they'll measure out in meters. So just something to keep in mind if you're ever wondering, like, oh, I ordered this amount and it's not, the same amount. It's just the difference between imperial versus metric. More things to know: if you're trying to pattern match and have specific lines from stripes or plaids match with each other, you typically will use up more fabric than you intend to, probably, just because of where your fabric may lay or how much you've cut out already. It's truly like a puzzle piece that you'll have to Tetris your way. Like, maybe it'll take a little trial and error, but if you give yourself a little bit more leeway and have a little extra fabric just in case you maybe mess up a panel and you accidentally reversed it. You have a little bit extra to play with. And another thing that you can be, keep in mind when making a costume is how can you be more sustainable with it. Unfortunately, with any kind of craft project, you will be wasteful in some sense because you're kind of creating something from scratch. So for cosplay, typically most of your waste will kind of come from fabric, so you'll have a lot of small scraps here and there, and if you don't want it to go to the dumpster or landfill, there are ways that you can kind of try and reuse it or resource it, or recycle it. So some things that people like to do is like they'll actually take scraps of fabric, cut them up, and just use them as pillow stuffers or like cushions, just to kind of not be wasteful. That's one less thing you have to go out and buy. Things that like for larger cuts of fabric, you can actually reach out to like local craft resupplies or schools that have art programs. I've done that a couple times where I just have so much fabric, I'm like, I don't want to throw it out, and I'd rather it go to someone that could use it. So I've reached out to like a local art program that was actually starting like a sewing lesson, and they had like a bunch of scrap fabrics they could play with. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways you can kind of go about it. Like if you're really into thrifting, you can actually go to the thrift store and find maybe clothes that have a certain look, and you can take it apart actually, and you can modify it to be whatever you need for your costume. You can even find like bed sheets. I'm the type of person that's like, use whatever you have available to you. Like, screw if it's accurate or not. If it works within your budget and what kind of look you want, then go for it. There's also like places you can resell fabric on or buy remnants online, like eBay or Etsy. And there's also like a cosplay resale site called Lumika that's like founded by cosplayers, and you can like post things on there too. And even at conventions, like we have a swap meetup at Ushicon, you could bring like leftover fabric scraps or like partial supplies for costumes and help give back to the cosplay community in that way without having to have it be thrown out or just sit in your closet. But yes, what else can you consider when thinking about fabric? So one thing I really, really like when it comes to costumes is when you get interesting textures. Like you have a mix of something that's shiny with something that's matte, and it gives you a lot more depth and dynamic when you're looking at it from afar and even up close. I have all these examples up here are like stage plays of their respective animes, and they do a really good job of kind of bringing a character to life, especially on stage when you're in a theater and they are 100 feet away from you. Like, how do you make these costumes really stand out and like show up well from afar? And one of the best ways to do that is through texture mixing. Another thing to think about is like, for fabric, there's certain things that tend to wear better. So if you have a school uniform, you may not want it to be so silky and it gets super wrinkled. And if you want it to not look as drapey in that sense, where you got a lot of lines of fabric and you want it to be a little bit more clean, you would consider like, doing something that's a little bit heavier or a little bit more flat in that regard. So that's something that I like to really consider, especially when it comes to school uniforms, or like even sport cosplays from like things like Haikyuu or Kuroko no Basket. You can use like athletic fabrics. That way, if you actually want to play in your costume, said sport, you could. The other thing that you can consider is like incorporating realistic elements for your costume. So things like making it look so dirty, so it looks like if you want to look like you came from a battlefield, you don't necessarily want a costume that is like super clean, pressed, pure white. You would want to age it in some way, whether it's through makeup or like actually just going out and getting dirt or like paint to replicate the look of dirt. I think it's a really cool way to do that. Like the example I have up here is from the Naruto stage play, and it's so cool because they actually start off with like cleaner looks at the beginning, and then as they obviously fight more, their costumes start to look more worn throughout the stage play. And they also achieve that through like makeup, which is really cool. And then when it comes to cosplay, I like to prioritize your comfort, because if you're going to be wearing a costume for more than like a couple of hours, I think your comfort is the most important. So accuracy accuracy be damned. I would say, like, at the end of the day, it's what you're putting on your body that you're most comfortable with. So I would say, like, if you know you get itchy from like wool fibers or certain kinds of blends, like maybe avoid that and pick something else that's more comfortable on your skin. At the end of the day, you're the one wearing it, or someone you know is wearing if you're making it for someone. So that's just something to keep in mind. I find really nice. And then if you can't find your exact design, there's a lot of different ways you can actually source fabric that have a lot more of the look you're going for. There's a lot of like custom printing websites these days between Spoonflower, Contrado, even Joanne at one point had like a custom fabric. But if you know someone that is familiar with like art programs, you can do this in Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever you have available. So you can even do this technically in MS Paint. And like design your own fabric, get the pattern made and printed. That's one really cool way you can, like, you know, if you can't find this exact plaid that you're looking for or this exact design, you can do it yourself. Another thing I have as an example in the middle where like I wanted a pink leopard fabric, but it wasn't dark enough. So I took like Sharpie and paint and just made the outlines darker. So you can take existing fabrics and just modify it to look closer to what you're looking for. And another thing you can do is like painting or dyeing fabric. So I have an example of on the far right, just like, hey, like I really wanted this pink gradient dye. So I just went to the store. There's different kinds of dyes out there. I would just double check the box because there's natural dyes and the dyes that are for synthetic fabrics. And I'll tell you on the box or the container itself, like, hey, this is the type of fiber content you would want for this to really show up well. I will say it will take some trial and error depending on how dark you want it to be, how much you want it to have a gradient, or if you just want to dye the whole thing. But the world is your oyster, and it's just like, what do you really want out of it? And then this is kind of like there's like a master Google spreadsheet actually for that, and I have it linked. I have a QR code at the end of the presentation that you can like scan for this presentation, and all these links are accessible. But unfortunately, there's not as many physical stores as there used to be. Nationwide, obviously, there's Joanne for the time being. Who knows what happens in a couple of months. Some places like Michael's or Walmart will have fabric. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for. If you go to Hobby Lobby, they also have a fabric section, but a lot of those places tend to have more quilting fabric. So like, you know, more of that craft versus like a costume, like where you can get a little bit more variety with like satins and whatnot. And I do have like a list of like some Texas-based fabrics that aren't just quilting. So unfortunately, there's a lot less than there used to be several years ago, especially before COVID. So you know, but it is great to kind of go into some of these stores because a lot of these stores they'll actually take remnants from factories, and you'll have like one-offs where like you'll see fabrics that you will only ever see in this one space and you can't really find online. So that's something you're really into. I encourage you to go to a lot of these stores and check them out. And then obviously there's a lot of online stores. There's a lot of really interesting historically accurate fabric vendors online as well. So yeah, there's so much more online, especially if you just want to look and kind of explore your options and you're not on like a time crunch or anything. I definitely encourage to go check out a lot of these sites online if you can. But yeah, so I threw an example of one of my costumes I've made where I kind of went through like, okay, how would I approach this costume? So at the time, on the image on the left is like, that's all I had as a reference because it wasn't animated, it wasn't really anything beyond concept art. So I kind of took that and was like, oh, you know, what do I want out of this project? You know, are there things I already have that I could use for this? Like, you know, there's some parts of this costume that looks like it's got more flow and drape to it. I need to pick materials that kind of work with that. But yeah, these are just kind of things I like to ask myself when I'm starting a costume. I think it's really nice to think about because you can just go out and just buy whatever fabrics you want, but if you really love like a character and you really want to translate that this love for this design in your own way, I think these are really great things to ask yourself. You know, do I have time or money to order things online, or you know, can I only buy stuff in store? Just those kinds of things to kind of help me save time in the long run the more I think about the planning. You know, another thing you can think about is like when it comes to fabrics and color, like some colors don't look good on me and some do, and I like to be mindful of like, you know, I'm not gonna necessarily put like a neon color on me as easily as I would like a darker color, things like that. And do I need to update fabrics or anything like that? So this is kind of like the character reference in my complete cosplay, but like this is kind of like the types of fabrics I use in this particular costume. And you know, most things I actually bought locally at my local Joann's, and what I try to do is find things to help make it not look so basic. So like I played around with heat transfer vinyl and like things like lace trim and like velvet trim to help it give it a little bit more definition, especially on the dress skirt. And then for other things like the wrap, I knew I wanted something that gives you a bit more texture, so I picked like this dupioni for my shawl, and I, you know, try to pick trims that kind of help it stand out. But yeah, that's pretty much it for my general presentation. Are there any questions in the audience that I can help answer? It's a really broad overview of like fabric, but just, you know, to kind of give you a little bit of a starting point. If there's no questions, I also have a binder up here that you can come up and look at different kinds of fabrics if you want to take a look at it. But yeah, other than that, I'll be like sticking around for the next like 20 minutes or so. If you'd like to come up and ask me any questions, more than happy to. But yeah, that's my presentation. And then here's I'll also have link here. These are kind of the sources for any other fabric if you want to know more about how certain fabrics are made. Cottonworks does a really good job of like explaining a lot of how fabric is just made in general. But yes, if you would like this presentation too, there's a QR code that you can save for your future reference. And that's it. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Yippee! Yeah.